All right, now you need to pay close attention. You need to cut the podcast wire.
I've never done this before. They all look like podcast
Calm down.
wires.
Calm down and focus. You have 5 seconds.
Wires.
Just cut it. Cut the podcast wire.
All right, hello.
Hey, everybody.
We didn't actually blow up, in case you were concerned for our safety there at all. So, I'm Graham.
My name's Ashkan.
And today's question is, starting a perfect float center seems really expensive with like 5 E's. If you were starting up a new center, where would you cut corners to save a little money? Or I assume also implied a lot of money.
Where would you cut corners? Not even if you would cut corners.
Yeah, it's kind of begging the answer there, huh?
Yeah, I mean, cutting corners is real tough in the float center because you're talking about building things in a way so that your building doesn't get destroyed, and so cutting corners is going to lead to like damage and stuff like that. So it's not a very easy game to play.
Dangerous corners to cut. It's like trying to cut a quarter of a block off with your car when you're driving. Like, it's going to involve some collateral damage as you drive through the lobby of something, you know?
And it can often lead to a lot more.
Is that a good metaphor?
Expensive.
Was that makes sense?
Pretty much. Yeah, I think people get it. It'll, cutting corners leads to really expensive repercussions, like much more money than you would have spent to begin with. And you have to be closed, and you have employees that you are going to want to still get paid and not just be like out of a job for 2 weeks while you're closed for renovations. So there's a lot of like long-term consequences from cutting corners.
Yep. You also end up with more octagons as opposed to squares.
Yeah. You're cutting out the corners. So. We can play the game. We can play the cutting corner game.
So let's back up slightly, which is to say what the most expensive parts of starting up are, to kind of say where you have even the most option to cut corners, right? So there's kind of like 3 big things that make up 80 to 90% of the cost in opening a float tank center. And those are going to be your actual build-out construction, putting in your walls, your soundproofing, your waterproofing, all the plumbing, stuff like that. That's one of the big 3.
Your float tanks themselves.
Yep, and sometimes even equal to construction, depending, of course, on what kinds of float tanks you can get. But those can get really expensive. Those are another huge one. And number 3 is just cash in the bank in case things go wrong, and to get you past that 1.5 years of runway where you're kind of expecting to take a loss as a business, And so, float tanks, I mean, you can get like less expensive models. And that's one way that you can save money is maybe you have your eyes set on some kind of float tank, but the price tag is $50,000 per unit. And you realize, no, maybe I'm going to go with $20,000 units or something like that, or look for used tanks.
Yeah, used float tanks I think is good because float tanks they're pretty sturdy, so buying them used is not, I don't think there's really that much of a detriment to like their quality after being used.
Yeah, especially if they were taken down and they were still operational and everything's in good order. And when you buy them used,
relatively new, if you're buying a tank from 30 years ago, that might be a little bit different. But
yeah. And if you get some kind of guarantee from the owner, if they say, hey, this is operational when I took it down, all the pump equipment works, that should go in the contract when you're getting that used tank, just to make sure that you can hold them accountable or return it or get a discount if things don't work when you go to set it up. Mm-hmm. So float tanks, definitely an area where you can save some money, just again, by spending less money on the units themselves. Construction, I mean, that's probably where we'll spend most of time talking about cutting corners, because that is, I think, what most people are curious about is the actual build-out of float tank centers is pretty dramatic and much more extreme.
Before we jump into construction, I think people can have a lot of expensive stuff in terms of interior design and things like that too, and I think those are really easy places to cut. You can easily spend $50,000 on furniture and stuff like that to make your lobby look cool. And that's almost like the easiest corner to cut in my mind, because you can totally just buy that stuff later.
We still don't have a sign hanging out front of our shop, so that's definitely a corner that we like. Signage might be another dramatic cost that you can cut out apparently for up to 7-8 years.
That's you can maybe like pull back your aspirations a little bit on the kind of aesthetic and crazy thing you're going for with your lobby. And after you get open and have some money coming in, you can put that money towards that. But that's certainly not going to do any like long-term damage to your building or, be that difficult to replace after the fact.
I mean, yeah, to start out, we found some just really comfortable used couches on Craigslist that were like a nice blue, and that served us for a really long time. For
I mean,
some
that
of
was our
furniture.
upgrade. Yeah, when we first started, it was just cushions on a wooden platform.
Shh, 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 shh. Don't tell them about the 2x4 chairs, you know?
So you can start a lot simpler than you may think you can.
So, and then the third big expense is money in the bank that you have in case things go wrong. And you can't really cut that down. I mean, you can start with less, and then that's just
It's just
less
a
of a
bigger
runway and terrifying and
Yeah.
and a big
I mean,
risk
you
legally
can cut
too.
it down. You just that's what you're sacrificing. You're sacrificing kind of being able to hit any speed bumps or
And you might also be sacrificing protection of your corporation, like of your corporate veil that's going into it. Like if you don't have enough money in the bank when you're starting up, then that's called undercapitalization, which is this way. There's this thing called the corporate veil that protects your personal assets from your business assets. And if your business goes under, you'd like for you personally to not lose your house and all of the money in your bank account and stuff like that. And one of the ways that they can get access to your personal finances through your business is by being undercapitalized.
yeah, probably like seriously undercapitalized. So I think there's some room in there, and there's just kind of it just gets riskier and riskier as you move that mark over.
And it's a good one to not plan on because you're going to probably near the end of construction be tapping into some of those reserves anyway. So yeah, don't plan on cutting that one back, but it will happen. So let's talk a little bit about construction. Are there any big other obvious ones outside of construction we should, you don't need the company car probably when you first start out.
Yeah. I mean, I guess marketing, some people have like a big marketing budget before they open. And I think that can be replaced with a lot of free marketing.
Yeah, lots of
So,
giving
like, you
away
don't-
free floats.
Yeah, you probably don't need to be taking billboards out or serious kind of expensive ad coverage in newspapers and things like that. Or I think there's a lot of ways to market that don't involve spending big chunks of money.
Yeah, I mean, even things like running a Groupon or something like that is another marketing that will cost you money because they're taking it out, but it doesn't cost you money up front, which makes that very different than a billboard in that sense.
Right.
So, construction.
Yeah, so this is the one that gets tricky because there are just like lingering effects of whatever you're doing. And really, I'd say, like, as you go along construction, I mean, the real expensive parts of construction are the soundproofing and the kind of water/salt proofing.
Yep, and the plumbing.
Right, which I guess I put in like the water salt camp. So like as you start to approach those two different areas, like I think the water and salt proofing one is a little bit. I'd be more hesitant to be cutting corners there, because that's where stuff gets seriously messed up. And like the plumbing and floor drains, it's stuff that's really hard to do after the fact and really expensive to do after the fact.
Right, if you double down on all the soundproofing and then you skimp on waterproofing, the salt's going to destroy all your expensive soundproofing anyway. So you do need always use protection. Always use protection.
And so, yeah, skimping on salt proofing and waterproofing really could lead to, the insides of your walls getting mold on them and serious damage that requires cutting out big chunks of sheetrock. All sorts of headaches and stuff come from that.
Similarly with the plumbing side, not putting in enough floor drains, not digging enough piping trenches to make sure that you can get proper drainage and stuff like that gets really dangerous for the longevity of your rooms and just for your daily operations and being able to, actually turn over your rooms and keep staff not stressed out and things like that. So it's also hard to skimp on the plumbing side of things. And so much of that is labor too. You're paying for the plumber's time in laying all these pipes and having the trenches and, again, installing the drains and the fixtures and stuff like that. So it's a hard place to justify not spending a base amount of money.
Yeah.
So what does that leave? Well, I mean, I do think soundproofing, being one of the most expensive parts, is a place that you should look at for where you can possibly cut corners on soundproofing.
Yeah. I mean, it's nice because it's kind of like there are certain parts of soundproofing that are very additive. Like you can add them on after the fact. You don't have to like tear something out to replace it with something else. There's a lot of just like upgrades that like you can do over the course of time that'll make things more and more soundproof without making you have wasted money in the first place. So it's nice. It's an easier game to play, I think, in terms of a little more strategy.
And a good kind of general approach, I think, is to just realize that the more interior something is in your walls for soundproofing, the more expensive and the harder it's going to be to go back and retrofit that in the future, as opposed to things that are just on the outside of your walls that you're trying to beef up or add more soundproofing onto, right? So, for instance, a lobby wall, if you start with just a single layer of nice soundproofing on your lobby wall and you want to see if that works, that's a great place to not immediately skip to installing 2 or 3 layers of quiet rock or drywall or something like that, because adding just an extra layer of sheetrock with green glue in between is not the most expensive thing to do. You know, you lose money on some of the painting and finishing work on the outside of that wall, but that's almost it, you know. And the more you get inside, and it's like you start with single stud walls, and now all of a sudden you want to upgrade those to double studs or upgrade them to single studs with a kind of a clip and channel system where you're creating an air gap that way. Now you're talking about having to tear off all of your waterproofing, all of the pre-existing soundproofing, bring it down to the studs, and maybe even move those studs in order to install a second set. And that's kind of starting from scratch. So you can see really quickly how the more interior you get towards the walls, just it gets crazier and crazier for the amount of money to upgrade things.
And there's a lot of soundproofing that you can... I mean, so the tough thing about soundproofing is it's hard to know as you're installing it what the right level is. So that's the other thing too, is you can start a little bit on the low side and then see like, oh, actually, you know, this part of it's working fine, but there's clearly sound getting in through here, and kind of upgrade the parts that need upgrading, rather than going kind of full steam on everything, and then there's really no way to know if you overdid it or not. So there's some benefit to being able to like add things on, and there are a lot of just like I was mentioning, additive processes, like adding another layer of wall or adding soundproofing to your door, which you can often do just through like a track in front of the door.
Yeah, doors are a good one. Starting with not the most hardcore $1,000 doors,
right.
But maybe starting with a $200 or $300
the hinges,
door
the frames, all that sort of stuff. You can spray in insulation type material into areas that were empty before, into ceilings and things like that. So you can install like secondary ceilings. There's kind of all sorts of stuff you can keep layering on with soundproofing as you see that it's needed.
Yep, and I guess planning on doing that on the exterior of the float room. So on the hallways, if you do have storage spaces in between your float rooms, which is a really nice buffer for soundproofing, being able to buff up the soundproofing on the inside of those storage rooms, because inside the float rooms, once your soundproofing is there, you kind of need to cover it with all your waterproofing to make sure it doesn't get destroyed. And then adding extra soundproofing from the inside of a room does become expensive, because now you have to take down your waterproofing in order to beef up the soundproofing again. So yeah, plan on, lobby sides of things, hallway side of things, again, storage closet in between your rooms, your workroom side for soundproofing that. Those are all things that are relatively inexpensive to add on. So all better places to skimp than on the soundproofing on the inside of the float rooms. And I mean, so another one that's kind of interesting is HVAC, especially because you can get such a range of HVAC units.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because there's not a great way to upgrade between the different styles of HVAC. So if you are deciding to go with something that's lesser than you want to end up with eventually, chances are you're going to have to pay a ridiculous amount of money in the future to upgrade to the system that you wanted to start with, way, way more than just actually starting with that system had you had the money. So as an example, I mean, we started with just wall heaters in our rooms and ceiling vents that were venting the air and letting fresh air in and things like that for the air exchanges. And we didn't even have a central HVAC until a couple years into running Float On. And that worked okay for us. It definitely got us to that point where we did have enough money to install the central furnace and AC on the ceiling. And so then from there, you end up with this central HVAC, usually a split furnace kind of air conditioning system. And the ideal is to have something called a mini split system, which actually, instead of ductwork, uses coolant lines and expands the coolant into the rooms. But that's a totally different setup than just a regular central HVAC. So if you want to upgrade from the kind of system we have to a more ideal mini split, again, you're talking about going in, tearing everything out of the ceilings, opening up the ceilings to run these coolant lines. And now, again, that cost gets higher than had you just started with it. So, and that's the difference with wall heaters and ceiling vents. You're talking about a few $1,000s, maybe getting up to 10 with the central kind of HVAC system. This is like for a 4 or 5 tank center, something like that. You're looking at in the $25,000, maybe $30,000 kind of range. And then for something like mini splits, all of a sudden you're looking at $40,000, $50,000, right? So that's kind of the range of differential you're looking at there, where you're deciding which one to go with and which corner to cut.
Yeah, but at least with HVAC, it's not like you're going to be damaging your building with a cheaper setup.
Yeah,
which is nice, as opposed to the water and salt proofing.
So although it's going to cost you more money to upgrade in the future, I would almost rather double down on the soundproofing inside the rooms, waterproofing inside the rooms, and just know that at some point you're probably going to have to close for a few weeks to, a month or something to
HVAC,
do crazy renovation, redo your entire heating, cooling system at some point.
Oh man, it's making me nervous just thinking about it. I remember when we had to do that. Like it's all
it was
back.
miserable. It's miserable. I mean, I guess know that like every corner you cut will cost you way more money down the road than had you been able to get away with not cutting the corner.
Yeah, and you have to be closed. Closing sucks all around. You're not making money. Your customers don't get to come in and float, and your employees don't have regular jobs. Like that's just like a triple whammy of.
I was just gonna say triple whammy. Good word choice. Yeah.
Of not good times, triple.
hat trick whammy. Yeah.
So, it's like a little hard to like plan on doing something like that just because it's such an unfortunate thing to have to do when you're actually kind of up and running and you have regular customers coming in and stuff like that. We use a lot of members every time we have to do a big project.
Yeah.
If we're closed for like a month or something, like it hurts. Like we had a huge drop in members and it takes us months to get back up to our normal numbers.
Yeah, so there's a lot of opportunity cost that goes into those closures. And a lot of times when, add to the $70,000, $80,000 you're now spending on renovation, all of the floats you could have been running that you're not running, because that's all an added cost too. And you can see really quickly this thing that maybe would have cost $50,000 at the very beginning now is costing $120,000.
Mm-hmm.
So, another solution is, hey, maybe you have this set amount of money that you have, and that's what you're going to spend on your float center. And maybe if cutting corners is where you're looking, you should consider going out and finding another investor or trying to get a bigger loan or waiting a little longer and just seeing if you can't get the extra money to actually start right, and save yourself some heartache down the road.
Mm-hmm.
So there you go. Yeah, our advice is don't cut. If you can, don't cut corners. Like it will bite you.
It's a tough business to cut corners.
It's a really tough business to cut corners in. If you have any other questions, go to floattanksolutions.com/podcast. Oh, see, I was cutting a corner there. I was just going to leave it.
Okay.
Show the kind of damage that comes when you don't finish your projects. /podcast. Send us in your questions. We'll answer them live for us, but, recorded for you.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's crazy in here.
Whole maelstrom of information going on. All right, and we'll talk to you all tomorrow.
Okay, bye.